There we go. All right. Well, hello there, chaps. Hope you're all having a wonderful day. Yes, lads. Forge gang! I am still a hard man. Let's go.
Camera recording.
Hold on a second. I'm going to turn that off. That really kills the vibes, don't it? No. There we go. All right, lads. We're live. We're live. As live as one could be. Indeed, yes. Now, it should not come as no surprise when I say that much of my heritage, I would even say most of it is Germanic. Specifically, Iron Age, North Central Europe, if that makes sense. And one of the things that I have talked about and discussed, though as of lately I haven't been mentioning much of it, and what has really come true to me particularly, and what the powers that be enforce is cultural genocide of neurodivergent people. And this continuous push by the powers that be to promote cultural genocide. Cultural genocide against pretty much everyone, regardless of race. It's not just people of European stock, it's pretty much everyone. Africans, Asians. You really have to keep in mind that everyone is having their culture destroyed because of globalism. Globalism destroys everyone's culture. Globalism breaks down and it dismantles every culture, every regional identity. It's not just Europeans, it's everyone. But what I've observed and what I've seen in my experience is this continuous assault against my heritage, continuous assault against my identity and who I am, and it has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with language and culture and identity, and nothing at all to do with any kind of skin color. That's a far-right rebranding of real identity. And the left has appropriated that from the far right and turns it around and uses it as like a weapon, as a means to weaponize its own drive to erase culture and identity. And there is as much a genocide against Africans and Asians and Native Americans as there are against Europeans. There is a globalistic drive to destroy all cultures, all identities, all people groups, and turn it into a global culture because at the end of the day, that is what the state's aim is to do. It is to get rid of all cultures, all identities, and all distinctions, linguistic, cultural, ethnic, biological. And it seeks to break all cultures down. And that's something that I want to emphasize before I continue. I think that I am a personal victim of cultural genocide as a neurodivergent individual. And I believe that my own family has tried to commit cultural genocide and cultural erasure against me by what they have done. Changing names on tomb markers or gravestones, trying to destroy cultural ties and heritage, trying to erase history or distort it, or at the very least distort it. And that, I am a victim of that. I am a victim of cultural genocide that has been pushed by the state. And it makes perfect sense to me. Because my heritage gives me generally as Germanic, but I also have like Celtic and Roman attributes. I have DNA from Romans and Celts, and I'm interested in that as well, but that's not most of what I am. Most of who I am is Germanic. Iron Age, early medieval Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and whatnot. And that is very important to preserve. It's important to persevere and preserve and continue that memory. It doesn't matter if one is Nigerian or one is Teuton or Slavic. One ought to be proud of their roots because that is everything that you are. Your parents gave you all of your genetic coding. Everything that you are is from the people that you come from. Doesn't mean that that is what should define you as an individual. Obviously, that should not be the case. But wanting to preserve and fight for and genuinely continue the legacy of your culture is very much a noble idea to do. If you're American and you want to preserve the institutions of the founders, that's a culture. That is a culture that you have inherited generationally, and you're trying to preserve that culture. Okay? If you're trying to fight for the documents and the writings of the founding fathers, that's a cultural preservation that you are trying to maintain. You are literally trying to preserve that heritage and that culture. You are trying to continue it down to your progeny. It's a multi-generational carrying down of that to the next generation that comes after you. You're fighting to preserve that. That is cultural preservation. That's a preservation of heritage. Wanting to preserve, like, the writings of the philosophers, wanting to preserve, like, Christianity or something, or the cultural heritage of Christianity, continue its traits, elongating its existence, fighting for, like, heritage sites, historic sites. Those are examples of wanting to preserve and elongate the culture and keep the memory of that culture alive. Yes, the present defines a person the most. The present state is the most defining trait of the individual. There's no doubt about that. But we wouldn't be here in this present if it was not for our past. or for our future. We could not exist at this specified moment in time and space were it not for something that occurred in the past, even in the distant past, because it had a drive, a mechanization that steered down where we're at now in the present. That's why cultural memory and perseverance is important. And yes, time is not relative. There appears to be four distinct dimensions or four higher dimensions of time. There are four dimensions of space and four dimensions of time. There are correlations, continuums, and time dilations all throughout the universe. And the more and more time that passes by, the more and more nanoseconds that continuously go by, the more distant you become to the past and the closer you get to the future. There's no doubt about that, but still, you wouldn't be who you are if it wasn't for your ancestors. You wouldn't be here and you wouldn't exist if it wasn't for someone who existed at an earlier time, an earlier stage on the earth. Evolution is a continuously driving and changing and unceasing force. It's just really a process of how life preserves itself, how life propagates and perseveres and propels itself forward, and has a generality. Life continuously adapts to the environment, to present challenges and risks, and then life creates further complications to deal with the increasing complications of habitability. Life adapts and even transcends and evolves into more complicated species that are more able to survive, that are more capable of finding survival. You know, mammals evolved. Mammals evolved and adapted traits that allowed them to survive the conditions immediately before and after the extinction of the dinosaurs, for example, and therefore mammalian traits became prescient and advantageous in the Miocene period, the period after the age of the dinosaurs when mammalian traits took over. Likewise, humans evolved to be less needful of their immediate body parts to survive and instead to use their brains, their language, and their organizational and spatial abilities, spatial organizational skills to build tools, organize into tribal bands, and fight in warfare or fight against predators, compete with predators and other carnivores in survival. Agriculture and civilization was adopted, it was transpired, and not all humans around the globe became agriculturalists. A lot of people were still nomadic. But at least for those in the Middle East, people in the Near East, the Middle East, they became farmers. They organized into cities and states. And then likewise, those centers of empires and civilizations spread out from the Middle East. Europe adopted, that's Southern Europe adopted and built its own kind of civilizations. And the Greeks honed in on the skills the technologies and the trades of government and taxation, administration, civil governance and organization and philosophy. And they added on to that. They added their Platonic philosophy, their skepticism, their cynicism, sophist philosophies, and higher thinking and higher critical skills that they used to organize the agora, organize around the city-state, the agora, the marketplace. They built academies and universities. The Romans took those ideas, as well as from the Orientals of the Middle East, and they took those skills and they added their civil customs, their civility, organizational skills, skills of higher intuition, and they built an entire empire out of that, from southern Europe to North Africa, to the Near East, to Anatolia, to Arabia, and so forth. And the Romans built a very flourishing empire, very multicultural, very flourishing empire that eventually was not able to govern and sustain itself. The Greeks and Romans worshipped a plethora of many different gods and goddesses as well. There was cults to Diana, cults to Mercury and Jupiter, cults to Zeus. And the Greeks and Romans had very good organizational skills with these religions. But ultimately, the religion of the Hebrews in Palestine and the direction and the conduction of Second Temple Judaism developed around the teachings of a enigmatic Messiah, if you will, or at least a person who claimed that they were the Messiah, who was crucified by the Roman authorities and the temple authorities, and whose cult, whose following, developed into a new religion, that of Christianity. And Christianity and the ecclesiastical organization that it developed and got from the Greeks spread westwards from Southwest Asia, from the Middle East, and from North Africa into the Balkans, into Greece, the Balkans, and then into the rest of the Roman Empire, as far as Italy and Spain and Arabia and India. But it was in the western half of that Christianity really built up and flourished in the Dark Ages. And even after the fall of Rome, the Christian church grew and it expanded. It westernized and it adopted more European traits instead of Middle Eastern traits that it originally had. In the Middle Ages, because of the expansion of Islam in the Middle East, Christianity's Middle Eastern roots were kind of cut off from Europe. And so the church developed in Europe distinctly into a monotheistic force, an ecclesiastical organized force that helped to get Europe out of the Dark Ages. And likewise, you have these northern barbarians in northern Europe that invaded the Roman Empire, contributed to the Roman Empire's demise, and then out of its ashes it built these Romano-Germanic states, Romano-Germanic kingdoms that became the foundations of Europe. By the time you get to Charlemagne, all of these different rival Gnostic and different types of Manichaean, Bogomil, and other types of Arian and Gnostic Christian heresies were put down, and only the state Roman Catholic Church was the truly only unifying religion in Europe. You know. And the Anglo-Saxons invaded England from southern Scandinavia, and they created England. They created the English tongue, the tongue that I'm speaking right now, the English language. Evolution adapting, environmental pressures pushing the forces of nature and life into an ever more complex and more stronger and smarter and more brilliant and evolving creation, if you will. The Vikings revived trade in Europe. The Celts created a lot of art and did a lot of artistic things. And the Slavs went into the Balkans. The Slavs went into Eastern Germany. They expanded into Poland and Bohemia. And the Slavs had their art and their culture. Some of them became Orthodox. Some became Roman Catholic. But the Holy Roman Empire was the state that persevered through the Middle Ages in trying to maintain this Gothic Romano culture or Roman Christian culture. The papacy, although the papacy had a lot of affiliation with the French, it ultimately tied itself in with the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire of Germany. And there was a lot of infighting between the popes and the Holy Roman Emperors, and it broke Germany and Italy apart. That's why Germany and Italy did not unify until much later, whereas France and England and then Great Britain unified a lot earlier. You know, Europeans went to the Holy Land on crusades to take it back from Islam. A lot of fighting and evolutionary tactical advantages and stuff was gotten out of the Crusades and other medieval wars. Wars against the Cathars, the Bogomils, the Gnostics, and a bunch of other people and stuff by the Catholic Church. But for Western society, it was the social contract that became very important. Anglo-Saxon common law and the Norman French court system that was transported to England developed into the West's modern judiciary system. Like our modern system of government evolved from medieval feudal contracts, and it created a more superior and superb government. And of course, the English language under the Normans became more sophisticated, more adaptive, and it survived the conquest of the Normans and became what it is today. You know, it became recognizable by the time of William Shakespeare, by the time of the Tudors. That's very important, this heritage of the West. And with the importation of Hindu Arabic numerals and Chinese gunpowder, Chinese abacuses, and this importation of Asiatic Mongol fighting tactics and knowledge, such as the navigational compass and the sailing carnival, the sailing ship, the Portuguese and the Spanish went out and sailed and discovered and made new discoveries, and they expanded Europe's horizons to two new continents. You know, the Vikings went to North America. But the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English and the French and the Dutch were the ones who went out and colonized and set up these new empires or overseas colonial states. And then the Protestant Reformation, well, the Renaissance brought back the classical learning of the Greeks and Romans. the higher philosophy, the higher learning, and higher thinking of the pagans of antiquity were revived and appropriated into the Christian mindset. The Reformation freed man from the oversight of the papacy. The Protestant Reformation created individual thinking, or at least brought back individual thinking. It separated and organized the individual from the tyranny of the state and the church. It gave people the freedom to choose their religion, although perhaps not always very peacefully or most humane. Protestantism freed the conscience of man. It freed the conscience of man, and it gave him the ability to try to acquire or to strive for liberty. And Protestants emphasized the quality and importance of wealth, of capital and wealth, and bettering oneself through learning and through education, acquiring wealth and building money and assets. Protestants really emphasized that a lot. So that was the gift of the Reformation, as well as the Bible. The Bible was translated into the common tongue, the common man's tongue. And then likewise, the Dutch created banks. Well, the Venetians were the ones that made banks and created bank exchanges. The Dutch added on to that with joint stock ventures, free money inflow and credit, systems of net credit and finance and whatnot. And then the English Puritans, they settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and they created like the early constitutions of the Americas. So these different Protestant sects from the 16th to the 18th centuries, they built the foundations of competitive capital thinking. Like a lot of capitalism and a lot of the impulsion of usury came from the Reformation. And then the Dutch and English revolutions and the French wars of religion furthered the creation on the continent of an absolutist monarchical absolutist state. And in Britain and the Netherlands, it created a sort of mercantilist republic. It built up the mercantilistic ideas, and it created a constitution, a consensus of a revolutionary consensus like in 1688, and created a constitution and a Bill of Rights, which was the direct precursor to the American Bill of Rights. And then the 13 American colonies, because of the way that they were founded by Cavaliers and by Roundheads, created this unique American mindset. Americans had to fight the Native Americans, and they had to compete for land and food and resources with other European colonists and with Native Americans, and this competition brewed and created the American spirit. The American dream was born out of such conflicts and such competitions and acquiescences. And by the time of the American Revolution, many of the ideas that a lot of people attribute to the Founding Fathers were already there. So the American Revolution was a transatlantic English, Anglo-Saxon, British constitutional reformatory Protestant revolution. The Founding Fathers just took what they had from beforehand, and they founded and created the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the framework of governments, the 3 different seats of power that they got from Diderot and from the Enlightenment thinkers. And then the Enlightenment was was basically the incorporation of deism into everyday life. Separation of church and state, the model of a free and civil abiding society and free civility, open and manifest destiny, and basically all the things that turned the West into the paramount force that it became. And then you add that with the Industrial Revolution, the building of factories and trains and the steam engine and railroads and the industrialization, mechanization, and capitalistic competition that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote about and described in Das Kapital, and the overall driving monopolistic cartels and the competition of capitalist labor, and the formation of labor unions, labor parties, unionization, and other things. Noam Chomsky said that one of the things that Lincoln advocated for was for the freedom of labor to organize and for labor to freely acquiesce and freely transcribe. And partake within the establishment. Unemployment benefits, labor pensions, workers' pensions, the 8-hour working day, the 40-hour working week, some days off, pensions for the elderly, for widows and orphans, and for other types of gains and stuff. A lot of the Union soldiers in the American Civil War and in Europe that organized in these labor union movements advocated for the idea of the notion of free labor, paid work and paid leave and paid labor as opposed to slavery or unpaid slavery and servitude. But the reality is that working in factories and working on the docks was extremely grim. Working in mines and working in these kind of conditions was very brutal and very grim. So, progressive legislation was passed, or progressive legislation had to be passed. You also have the rise of the anarchist movement, which wanted to do away entirely with the state. The rise of the anarchist movement and the anarchist leagues and their kind of movement to try to get rid of the state and stuff. But naturally, with the formation and the assumption of the nation-state systems, that is what propelled, together with the imperialistic ambitions of Europe, into World War I. World War I was itself a result of a post-Napoleonic consensus of nationalism overtaking the balance and consensus of royal absolutism, together with romanticism, in driving Europe into an industrial world war. The aftermath of which no one was satisfied with, nobody liked or cared much for, and so inevitably fascism and communism and totalitarian systems took over and tried to build people's utopias, tried to build the perfect utopian creation or the perfect utopian dream, which instead led to the Second World War and to genocide and to mass slaughtering, and to a great deal of millions of lives being wiped out. A consequence of which the Europeans went under, and the Americans surpassed them. So we have the Americans with their industrial base, their incredibly large citizen workforce and free labor, and the military draft of American GIs, and Americans going to different theaters of war, different fields of war, and having different bases and building up, created the Pax Americana, built up the Pax American Empire in the face of the Second World War. And therefore, the movement away from British imperial capital to American imperial capital. And then, likewise, the Cold War between the capitalists and the communists that lasted for 40 years, and then just at the end of the 80s, the communist bloc just simply collapsed. They had lacked any ability to innovate or make anything new. And everything was just very cheap knockoffs and just very cheaply made, cheaply manufactured, shabby goods. And therefore, naturally, because the state controlled all aspects of production and distribution, it failed. It failed to innovate and failed to transition into the technological, electronic telecom and teleprompter revolution of the late 20th century. The computer revolution, the revolution of the telecom and electronic computrix of the 70s and 80s, and so the Soviet Empire fell. It also was not going to be able to hold on to such a large mass of land from East Germany to China forever. And so the communist system fell apart. And with decolonization, you have proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, which itself is a process of post-colonial traumatism. Post-decolonizational, post-colonialist, and post-Western systems created by dictators and heads of state who interfeud and fight, and in turn leads to the formation of radical Islamicist sects, which at the turn of the 21st century spewed out into the War on Terror, with 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, and just the war against all of these Islamist terrorist cells. So, but once again, that's just an aspect of human evolution, human biological competition, and the increasing and ever sophistication of life itself. From single-cell amoebas, protocells, simple chemical buildup and processes of RNA chains in a mold or in kind of this amino acid mold that become eventually self-replicating and proactive cells that develop into more sophisticated cells, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, archaea cells, and cell colonies that in time develop into plants, animals, and fungi or fungus, and multicellular life forms such as tapeworms and primitive jellyfish type of animals and other things in the Cambrian period, the Cambrian expansion and the sophistication of those life forms, and the appearance of vertebrate animals, early fish, scaly fish, and then finally just full-on actual vertebrate fish that then become amphibians that go on the land. And these amphibians that adapt and become reptilians or reptiles that go on into becoming like giant lizard animals in the pre-dinosaur period. Then, of course, there's the Mesozoic, the dinosaur era, and these giant reptiles, giant lizards that inhabit the earth in Pangaea or whatever. These different early continents that are very different from what the earth is today. And then with the extinction of these dinosaurs, you have early mammals and birds coming around together with grass and other current types of plants that formed in the Cenozoic. And increasingly more sophisticated mammals like these what are those animals that lemurs, that's it, lemurs, these types of lemurs that jump on trees and become primates, and these different kingdoms or different domains of primates, and then like Australopithecus, Heidelbergensis, Proto-Man, Protomythicus, Australopithecus, these different types of ape-like species that become sapiens and then Homo sapiens, and their increasing evolution to Homo bergensius, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, and everything else in between that, and their adaptation to making fire, domesticating animals like dogs, and living in caves and in campsites, and hunting mammoths in the Ice Age, and leaving Africa, leaving Central East Africa, and going around the entire globe, and like agriculturalists and civilizations and the development of religion in the Axle Age, transition from stone to bronze to iron to steel. And the increasing sophistication of civilization itself, and the development of human language and human comprehensive and spatial and mathematical analytical skills, new types of inventions and contributors of inventors such as Isaac Newton, Plato, Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, who invented the Tesla coil, manufactured and fabricated synthetic technologies that helped to contribute to the computer revolution in the late 20th century, the advancement of atomic science and therefore of the atomic bomb and atomic warfare, and just overall the increasing sophistication of society as a whole. But you have YouTube channels like Edward Dutton, the Jolly Heretic, who says that for the last 100 years, humans are increasingly getting dumbed down. Analytical intelligence, abstract intelligence is being discarded, and social skills, writing skills, mathematical skills are going down. They're in a steep decline. People are losing their intelligence. Overall IQ scores go down. Overall job performance skills go down. In Britain, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, Scandinavia, Germany, Italy, France, Western Europe, etc. And these traits that built the West, these very things, these methodologies that built Western civilization, are now being used by the woke to destroy it, to destroy the richness of the developed world, to bring it down and to turn it into a post-colonial, post-Western, post-English, post-Christian society, and just really create overall chaos and just absolutely bad things. There's also an over-effeminization in society. Men are becoming increasingly effeminate. Women are becoming increasingly masculinized. And there are gender wars, gender competitions, etc., that is also increasingly happening in Asian and Western societies. Life expectancy is also dropping. Secularism is dropping. Scientific progress has slowed down dramatically since the 1960s. And just the overall net worth of discoveries is failing. Is humanity losing to AI? Is artificial intelligence going to take over and replace human intelligence? Probably not for a very long time. At least not for a couple of decades, at most. But yeah, I think that culture and heritage should be preserved. I think that the contributions of one's forebears are important. And I really like Varg Vikernes. I'm very much into what Varg Vikernes talks about and what he discusses and the things that he says. And I find it ironic that there is not a single Christian fundamentalist who even remotely cares about, or even remotely in any way wants to try to cater to the neurodivergent community. It's pagans and atheists that are catering to that. They're actually letting neurodivergent individuals come in and participate in ways that Christians do not. But the future is very bleak. It's also very dark. And I think we're going to go back into tribal and religious warfare. And progress is going to be halted for the next century or so. As AI becomes more, people become more reliant on AI, and people start fighting and feuding in the cities and stuff. And I don't advocate for that, but it's just, I know that's what's going to happen. It's a fact. Europe and the United States are going to balkanize. It's just a fact. It's only a matter of time. The United States is going to balkanize, and so is Europe. And there's going to be more of a clash of cultures, a clash and a warring and very twisted and double-crossing and diminishing of ways, a parting of ways from higher civility. And this is sad, but this is what this is what progress does. Progress and the quantity of food, the quantity and acquisition of transport and accommodation, for a time can sedate entire populations. It can certainly raise their living standard. It can improve medicine and increase life expectancy and life longevity and health. But ultimately, people are going to be what they have always been since the Stone Age, since the Ice Age. They have a caveman mentality, a Paleolithic Pleistocene mentality with 21st century technology. And naturally, men are going to fight. And that's just part of what human nature is. There will be more wars, and there will be more fighting and more domestic and foreign conflicts. And that will no doubt stimulate and increase further evolution. It will further build evolution and further advance, because trade and interaction and conflict and feuding and competition is what breeds innovation. It is peace and tranquility that stifles innovation and intelligence and creativity. War is the natural course of things. Fighting is just a natural trait. And death is just a natural process that occurs on everything that is alive. Everything that lives must inadvertently come to its end. Anything that does exist must one day not exist, just as in the past it did not at one point exist. It only existed in a state of time, a state of being, of self-awareness, self-intelligibility, for just a time, for a season, and then it's not there. That is just the way of how this planet works. It is just simply the way of how evolution plays out in the universe. Whether it be chemical or biological or celestial, That is just the course of how things operate, and natural adaptability is the way to survival. So, anyways, that was all that I really wanted to say. That was about it. Are there any questions in the chat? So, I don't see nothing in chat. I'll wait a little while and see what chat has to say. But nobody's posted, so I don't see nothing in the chat. So yeah, I am Imperator of Forge. And this is just the natural way of how things go. Nature's laws are unbendable. Yes, they change as the circumstances of the planet change. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But otherwise, nature's laws are unbreaking. They are unyielding, but ever changing, ever adapting, ever numerous as they are. They cannot be written down. It is a code of laws that is not to be written down. It is just simply what it is there. It is natural law. The law of nature's God, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these rights to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's in the Declaration of Independence. So, there will be more conflicts in the future to come. Forge Gang will be ever prepared to meet those challenges and adapt to them. And this is just the way that things are. So, I am your host, Imperator of Forge, Forge Warhammer, and thank you for watching, and have a good day.